Hey, welcome to another episode of Coffee with Bruce. So today I'm going to try to explain blockchain just at a very high level. And so I'll start off by explaining what does a ledger do, and we'll move on to distributed ledgers and how blockchain helps you implement them. So a ledger is basically a way of keeping track of some amount of information about who's got what and transactions involving exchange of something from one place to another. Classic example would be a bank account where you keep track of how much money is in the account and you keep track of money coming in and money going out. So we can think of a very simple example where I've got two bank accounts here, one with 3 units of stuff represented by 3 blocks, another one over here represented by 2 units of stuff or 2 blocks. And if I wanted to move money from one account to the other, I could just pick up a block and move it over here. That's pretty simple, but of course in the real world we don't want to do physical objects like moving blocks around. We do this all electronically, so we could think of having, in the first account, we've got an electronic entry that says the value of this account is 3, we've got another account, the value is 2, and if we want to move money from one account to the other, we just have to say, well, we're just going to increment the account over here by 1, and decrement the account over here by 1, and by doing those 2 transactions and doing them both together as kind of an atomic transaction, we've moved the money from one place to another, and then it can all be done electronically just by doing a few little electronic transactions. So that's how ledgers work. But of course, somebody has to be in charge of making sure that if we move money out of one account and into another, that we do it in a way that's consistent, that we don't sort of start creating money out of thin air, that we don't accidentally move money and then have somebody say, no, I never moved it. So there's a whole lot of trust that we typically put in somebody like a bank to take care of that for us. And when you're trying to move money from, say, one bank account to another, when those accounts are with different banks, we often go through some kind of central party in the middle who handles the settlement. And that's why you'll often find that when you're moving money internationally in particular, it takes like 3 days to move the money because it gets moved from one bank to a central clearinghouse and then from there to the receiving bank. And there's a fair bit of checks and balances going on to make sure that everything is legit and everybody trusts each other. So the idea of blockchain is that it would be great if you could do that without having to have the central authorities like banks. And there's lots of reasons why you might want to do that. But one is simply you could, at least in principle, make it more efficient if you didn't have to have these central authorities in the middle. So the core idea behind blockchain is to create distributed ledgers that work without any central authority like a bank. And the kind of clever thing about distributed ledgers is that using techniques that have been around for quite a few years now, the distributed ledger technology lets you create these ledgers that are replicated in many places, and it's the fact that they're replicated in many places that makes them reliable. So if we have one account that says this person owns 3 units of stuff, let's say 3 Bitcoins, for example, and then that person wants to pay money to another person, they can say, okay, I'd like to transfer 1 Bitcoin from my account to yours. So we make a transaction that records the decrementing of my balance by 1, the incrementing of your balance by 1, and we create that transaction and we stick it into this distributed ledger, which is just a collection of records of transactions. And the clever thing about Bitcoin or other forms of blockchain is they create an incentive structure for lots of players to keep track of that ledger, to replicate it in lots of places, and to do it in a way that makes it quite resistant to various forms of attack, so that, for example, it's very hard to go back and rewrite history to say, no, I never gave you that money. The way it works is that every time a transaction gets committed into the ledger, that it's actually done as a puzzle. So the idea is that somebody wants to put a transaction into the ledger and they say, okay, I'd like to do this transaction. And this is sort of posted out into the universe of people who'd like to help. And they all run off in parallel and try to solve a puzzle. And these puzzles are quite hard. They take quite a lot of computational effort. They actually cost money to solve because you have to apply power and compute capacity to solve the puzzles. So a whole lot of people run off and try to solve the puzzle. And the first one to solve it can very quickly say, look, I've got a solution. It's easy for everybody to check that that solution is correct. And so that person now gets to be the one who says, I'm adding this transaction into the ledger. And everybody then says, okay, yep, puzzle's correct. I'm going to copy your version of that transaction and stick it in my copy of the ledger. So now the ledger gets a little bit longer, that transaction is committed, and everybody in the world can see that it was done. And because it's now copied down in dozens or hundreds of places, it's very difficult for anybody to go and uncommit that transaction. And so the blockchain just gets longer and longer with time, with more of these transactions getting added, and you have now a mechanism by which you are able to move money from one place to another. Well, when I say money, you're moving units of stuff. Well, what is money anyway? It's kind of a thing that we all agree represents value. And just like, people think that diamonds are worth something and pieces of gold are worth something, it's a little bit arbitrary why those things are valuable, but the fact that there's a short supply of them and it takes work to get more of them is part of what retains their value. Turns out it's fairly hard to generate a new piece of Bitcoin. You have to do a whole lot of puzzle solving to get it. And so that's how we've established that the Bitcoin is a unit of value. And it's what gives an incentive for people to go and solve these puzzles so that the operation of the blockchain, which depends on people continually solving puzzles, that gets incentivized by the availability of these Bitcoins or other forms of cryptocurrency. So that in a nutshell is what blockchains are doing. They're giving you a structure by which you can have a ledger, a set of transactions stored in a whole lot of places, done in a way that's pretty reliable, creating an incentive structure in which lots of people have a reason to keep that blockchain running smoothly, continuing to add new transactions to it, and the people who do all the hard work, solving puzzles, spending their computing cycles to do so, get paid in units of cryptocurrency, and that sort of keeps the whole system working. It's a little bit amazing, really, when you think about the fact that these units of value kind of got created out of nothing, but to some extent, that's the history of money. So we'll have more to say about this on another occasion, but that in a nutshell is how distributed ledgers, blockchains, and cryptocurrencies all work.
Perfect.